200,000 miles from home, there is a bang. The entire ship shudders. Warning lights flare across the panel. And through the window, one of the three astronauts sees something that makes his blood run cold. A thin cloud of gas, venting silently out into space. It's oxygen. Their oxygen. The very stuff keeping them alive is pouring out into the void, and there is not a single thing they can do to stop it. They are farther from Earth than any human being has ever been. No one can come to get them. No rescue ship exists anywhere in the universe. And they are running out of air. Houston, we've had a problem. This is Apollo 13. And what happened over the next 4 days, how 3 men in a dying spacecraft, 250,000 miles from home, clawed their way back to Earth, is still the greatest survival story in the history of space. It was April 1970, and honestly, the world had almost stopped paying attention. Humans had already walked on the moon less than a year earlier, and a third landing had come to feel almost routine. Apollo 13 was supposed to be another triumphant stroll across the lunar surface. And, for the first 2 days, everything was perfect. Too perfect. The crew even filmed a live television broadcast from space, which barely any network bothered to air because going to the moon had unbelievably already become boring. There's a strange twist even before the rocket ever left the ground. Just 3 days before launch, one of the original crew members was abruptly pulled from the mission. He had been exposed to German measles, and doctors feared he might fall ill at the worst possible moment, so a backup pilot named Jack Swigert was swapped in at the last minute. The grounded astronaut, Ken Mattingly, was heartbroken to lose his one chance to fly to the moon. But that cruel twist would end up mattering enormously, because when everything went wrong, Mattingly was on the ground, healthy, and would spend sleepless hours in a simulator helping to invent the very procedure that would bring his crewmates home. He never did catch the measles. 56 hours into the flight, Mission Control asked the crew to do something completely routine. Flip a switch to stir the oxygen tanks, keeping their contents from settling. It was a task they had done many times before. But this time, deep inside oxygen tank number 2, damaged wiring sparked. And the tank exploded. The blast tore through the back of the spacecraft, crippling the service module, the entire section that held their main supply of oxygen, water, and electrical power. In a single instant, the mission changed completely. Landing on the moon was gone, forgotten, irrelevant. There was now exactly one goal, and it was brutally simple. Get these 3 men home alive. The problem was, the ship they needed to do it with was dying beneath their feet. Their solution was both desperate and brilliant. Attached to their crippled ship was the lunar module, the little spider-legged lander named Aquarius, built to carry 2 men down to the moon's surface and back. It had its own oxygen, its own power, its own engine, so the crew shut down the dying command module to save its last resources for the return home and crawled into the lander to use it as a lifeboat. There was just one enormous problem. The lunar module was designed to keep 2 people alive for about 2 days. Now it had to keep 3 people alive for 4. And that led to the crisis that nearly killed them. With every single breath, every time a person exhales, they release carbon dioxide, and in a sealed spacecraft, that gas has to be scrubbed out of the air, or it builds up until it becomes poisonous. The lunar module had scrubbers, but nowhere near enough for 3 men over 4 days. There were spare filters on board, but they were the wrong shape. The command module used square filters. The lunar module took round ones. A square peg, quite literally, that would not fit a round hole. So down on the ground, engineers dumped onto a table an exact copy of every single item the astronauts had with them, and nothing else, and were told to make the square filter fit, using only that. What they invented was a contraption of plastic bags, cardboard torn from a checklist cover, a sock, and a whole lot of duct tape. They read the instructions up to the crew step by step, the astronauts built it in orbit, and when they finally switched it on, the carbon dioxide levels began to fall. It held. Duct tape and a sock had saved 3 human lives. But survival was still a long, miserable grind. To conserve every last bit of power for re-entry, the crew switched nearly everything off, including the heat. The temperature inside the spacecraft plunged toward freezing, down to around 38 degrees Fahrenheit, just above 0 Celsius. Water condensed on every surface, dripping down the walls. They were rationed to just a few ounces of water a day, and grew dangerously dehydrated. They barely slept, shivering, exhausted, soaked to the bone, one of them growing genuinely sick. For 4 days, they endured a cold, wet, dark metal box, hurtling through space. And to get home, they first had to go the wrong way, away from Earth. There simply wasn't enough power to turn the ship around. Instead, they had to let the moon's own gravity do the work, swinging all the way around the far side of the moon and using it like a slingshot to fling themselves back toward home. As they coasted around the back of the moon, the 3 men of Apollo 13 passed farther from Earth than any humans in history. A record for the greatest distance ever traveled from our planet that, remarkably, still stands to this very day. Then came a maneuver that should have been impossible. To steer toward home, they needed to fire the lander's engine at precisely the right instant for precisely the right length of time. Normally, a computer handles this, but the computer was powered down, and the explosion had wrapped the ship in a glittering cloud of debris that made it impossible to navigate by the stars, the way astronauts normally would. So they did it by hand, using the Earth itself, framed in the tiny window, as their only reference point. The commander manually flew the burn, holding the ship steady by eye and by feel, while his crewmates called out the seconds. Get it wrong, and they would either skip off the atmosphere and be lost forever, or come in too steep and burn up. They got it right. The final test was re-entry itself. The command module, the only part of the ship with a heat shield able to survive the fiery return through the atmosphere, had been switched off and frozen for days, something no one had ever attempted before. Engineers on the ground had to write a brand new power-up procedure from scratch in a matter of hours to wake up a spacecraft that was never designed to be turned back on in space. And it was Ken Mattingly, the astronaut bumped from the flight, who sat in the simulator testing it, again and again until it was safe to send up. As the crew jettisoned the ruined service module, they finally saw the damage for the first time. An entire panel blown clean off, wreckage hanging loose, and understood just how lucky they were to be alive at all. Then they dropped toward Earth into the communications blackout that comes with every re-entry, when the searing heat of the descent cuts off all radio contact. For 3 long minutes, Mission Control could do nothing but wait in silence, not knowing whether the frozen heat shield had cracked in the cold, whether the crew were alive, or already gone. 3 minutes stretched into what felt like a lifetime. And then, a voice, crackling through. Parachutes, 3 red and white canopies blooming open over the Pacific Ocean. All 3 men, alive. Apollo 13 had made it home. They never reached the moon. By the original goal of the mission, Apollo 13 was a failure. But it became something far more remarkable, what people came to call a successful failure. Because for 4 days, 3 exhausted, freezing, half-poisoned human beings and a room full of engineers on the ground who flatly refused to give up, stared down an impossible situation with duct tape, arithmetic, and sheer stubborn ingenuity, and pulled off one of the greatest rescues ever accomplished. We remember the moon landings for their triumph, but Apollo 13, we remember for something harder and maybe more human. Not what we can do when everything goes right, but what we're capable of when everything goes wrong. 3 men should never have made it home. And yet, because nobody up there or down here was willing to stop trying, they did.